Hello everyone, up next we have Audrey Adeline. Audrey is a security researcher at SquareX and the author of Browser Security Field Manual. That's her book over there. She leads the Year of Browser Bugs project, which has exposed major bug flaws like browser sync jacking and polymorphic extensions. And her discoveries are covered by Forbes, Bleeping Computer, and many other magazines. Also, a big thank you to SquareX for sponsoring our cloud security talk and supporting these important conversations. With that, I would welcome Audrey to the stage to talk about browser native ransomware in a cloud first world. Let's hear it out.
Thank you so much. Hi everyone, my name is Audrey and today I'll be speaking about a new class of ransomware attacks that we discovered called browser native ransomware and how this will impact organizations in a cloud first world. So just a brief intro, I think it's mainly been covered, but I'm a security researcher at SquareX. I currently lead a project called the Year of Browser Bugs where we pretty much expose 1 to 2 architectural vulnerabilities in a browser every month. In addition to that, I've also written the Browser Security Field Manual, so if you guys are interested in learning more, we can surely have a conversation after this. But just a brief context on why we've decided to do this talk. So our team in the past year has spent a lot of time doing research that are breaking enterprise security architectures. So for example, in DEF CON last year, we did one research that exposed several architectural vulnerabilities of secure web gateways and an attack called last mile reassembly. Just this past Saturday as well, we've done a talk on data splicing attacks that bypass a lot of enterprise DLP solutions. We've also done the same with email security, a bunch of others. And so today, we really want to focus on ransomware and the current anti-ransomware solutions and how the ransomware evolution has changed. So just a brief overview on the agenda. We've done the introductions, but before we go into browser native ransomware itself, I thought it's really important for us to take a look at the state of ransomware today, what we know about them and how we're tackling them today. And following that, we'll take a look at how browser native ransomware is different from traditional ransomware and deep dive into a couple of case studies on how these ransomware attacks can occur. And last but not least, we'll close with the impact of browser native ransomware on organizations, as well as some key takeaways and opportunity for questions. So what do we know about traditional ransomware? And you guys are probably quite familiar on this part, so I'm just gonna quickly brief through. So typically a ransomware attack involves 3 points. The first one is initial access, and this can be done through a variety of means. So the key point here is it involves tricking the victim into downloading and executing the ransomware file, but the initial access point can vary a lot, right? It can be through emails, maladvertising campaign, drive-by downloads, and so on. But ultimately, it always ends in a malicious file, and sometimes there are some fileless variants being executed. Following that, once the ransomware is executed, a lot of the local files will be encrypted. We've also seen some variants where the entire device is being locked, and the decryption key is then held as ransom for the attackers. We've also seen many attacks where a double extortion technique is imposed, where the attacker basically says, and in addition to the decryption key, will also threaten to leak your data if you don't pay the ransom. So there's many types of ransomwares that we've seen in the past. So the most common one is, of course, the crypto lockers or the encryptors, where you go ahead and encrypt all the files locally. So that's the most classic and probably most common form as well. We've also seen several variants that lock the entire device and prevent the user from actually accessing the device or any files and apps on it. We've also seen something called scareware, where essentially you get a bunch of malicious pop-ups that come up, and they basically tell you like, oh, maybe we've discovered some virus or some technical vulnerability, and in order to access your computer, please go ahead and pay this ransom. And the fourth type that is pretty common is something called leakware. So this is quite related to the double extortion technique, where instead of just encrypting the files, they may go ahead and copy out a copy and threaten to leak the data if the ransom is not paid on time. And I think just to illustrate how mature the industry has evolved, there's even a ransomware as a service, where a lot of providers are now providing ransomware services where they're in charge of the entire distribution, kind of ransomware collection and restoration for an exchange of the ransomware fee. And regardless of what technique you've seen, right, all of them has a common point where they involve some sort of local file or local process execution. So how are we defending against ransomware attacks today? There's typically two types of tools. The first one is EDRs, and the second one is more specifically anti-ransomwares. So how do EDRs work today? EDRs typically work by looking for, inspecting files and local processes. So in terms of files, they may look for known malwares, some certain file encryption processes or malicious executables that look suspicious. When it comes to process monitoring, because they have access to the kernel level, they can go ahead and look at what files and apps are running and look for suspicious processes that are trying to access multiple files at once. Now, they can also inspect memory to look at what sort of code is being run in the memory and identify encryption algorithms and other malicious payload as well. What about anti-ransomware? So anti-ransomware is a little bit more specialized in detecting ransomware. So they typically have some sort of known ransomware detection. They have their own threat feeds. But in addition, they also monitor suspicious file activities like encryption that's going on. A lot of the more advanced ones also have canaries and deception files that once they get encrypted early, they become early warnings for the security teams to be able to stop encryption and perhaps look for the decryption key as well. So the key point here is existing solutions are really good at looking at local files and processes, but what if the new age of ransomware attacks don't involve them at all? And here's the key point, right? None of these solutions today have any visibility into the browser. They don't understand, how users are interacting with web apps, SaaS apps, what they're doing on there. They have no identity context. So for example, you might have your personal Gmail and your work Gmail. Which identity are you using to conduct certain behaviors? They have no visibility into data access patterns as well as how third-party apps are interacting with each other. And before we go into the technicality of browser-native ransomware, I think I want to share a little bit more on the thesis of why browser-native ransomware will become super relevant in the future. And to do this, we really need to take a look at how the way we have worked has changed in the past 20 years. So first of all, one of the biggest change, we're in the cloud village, is of course the fact that we have now adopted cloud for a lot of our storage and activities. But the other major change is also that the browser itself has evolved a lot, right? So in the past 10 years or so, you start to see a lot of new browser features like WebAssembly, WebRTC, all these communication channels come out. And the main implication of this is the web app experience is now significantly better and almost at parity to a lot of local apps. And the implication to that is a lot of people have now moved a lot of their enterprise workflow into SaaS apps instead of using local apps. And similarly, we're also downloading less and less file by the day. So in other words, the bulk of enterprise workflow is now being created, shared, and accessed through the browser without ever involving the endpoint. So if you're looking at, the most recent graduates, so I have a cousin who just recently graduated, and I was telling her about all these local apps that we used to use, and they're not familiar at all, right? To them, when they log on to the laptop, all they go through is the browser. All their work is being done through apps like Google Docs, Figma, Salesforce, even traditional apps like Office 365 now have a web version. And as I mentioned earlier, similarly, most of our files are now being created and stored in OneDrive, Google Drive, all these kind of file storage on the cloud, and we're no longer downloading as many files anymore. So I think Gartner also estimates that 85% of business applications by the end of this year will be SaaS apps, and more than 4/5 of our data is now being stored in the cloud. So because of this, ransomware that traditionally resides in the endpoint, in order for them to remain relevant, it is a must for them to move on to the browser as well. And as we have seen, existing tools don't look at any process in the browser at all. So what is browser-native ransomware? So as we've seen initially, most ransomware currently rely on files and local processes, but because we have moved on to a cloud-native world, we no longer store a lot of our company resources on the device. Instead, a lot of them are in SaaS apps, which the main gateway is really the user identity. So typically when you have access to, let's say, the user email and password, you pretty much have access to the entire company resource, which is why for browser-native ransomware, the attack begins in identity attacks. Following that, once you have access to different SaaS apps, you can go ahead and exfiltrate, make a copy, delete all the data in each of those SaaS apps subsequently, and then use that as an kind of like a hostage to gain extortion from the company. So what are the key differences between traditional and sort of browser-native ransomware? So we already talked about the first point, which is the initial access point. Now, in terms of the identity, this is pretty interesting, right? Because when you attack someone's device using ransomware, the only identity you're concerned about is whatever is logged onto the device at the moment. But when you think about the browser, you probably have multiple identities going at once. So even using the Gmail example earlier, right? You might be logged onto your personal Gmail and your work email in the same browser. You might have different apps, some for personal, some for work use cases. And as you can see, because everything is a browser, it's totally possible for the attacker to first compromise the personal emails, where it's much, much less secured, and then laterally move towards enterprise identities. And then the third point is actually the amount of data they can access, right? Previously, if you use a traditional ransomware, you're limited to accessing data that's stored in that particular device. But now, because of the existence of shared drives and shared resources within an organization, the moment you compromise one profile, you're able to access everything that that person has access to, including a lot of shared resources that are on those apps. Beyond that, the exfiltration, encryption, and deletion is pretty similar, but we'll take a look at a couple of case studies just to make this a little bit more real. So today we're going to be going through 3 case studies, but I like to, one thing that I really want to emphasize is these are just examples, right? Browser native ransomware can manifest in many different ways, and the key point is as long as it works by, taking the user identity and using that to exfiltrate data and using that to gain ransom, that is classified as browser native ransomware. So the first type of browser native ransomware is targeting Google Drive and these file storage services, right? In this example, the attacker will use a brand impersonation attack to gain access to the user's Google Drive. And there they will go ahead and exfiltrate and delete all the files that's being stored in their Google Drive, including those in shared drives, and demand a ransom to stop them from leaking the company's sensitive files. So we'll quickly take a look at how this looks like. So this is a very typical setup of an enterprise user, right? They might have some files that they uploaded to the Google Drive, and they might also have access to the company's shared drive where, other members of the company, maybe their colleagues, maybe some customers have uploaded some shared documents as well. And let's say the user is now looking for an app to, let's say, draw some diagrams. So they go ahead to Google, and then they'll go type in UML diagram creators, and you'll see that the first outcome here, the first search result looks like it's from Draw.io. But what they don't know is usually for most Google searches, the sponsored slot just goes to the higher bidder. Yes, Google does some verification and try to understand whether these bidders are legitimate, but for the most part, it's done very loosely. So you see that the legitimate Draw.io website, kind of their search result is super similar to the sponsored result. So here the user is going to think that they have entered Draw.io. Once they click on it, they hit on a landing page, and you'll notice that even the URL is very, very similar to the existing Draw.io page. And typically the way that this app works is they'll go ahead and ask you to integrate to some form of app, so usually your Google Drive or your GitHub, where they can put down the results of your graphics there. So this is a very common integration request that looks exactly the same as a legitimate app. So here now they're redirected to Google's OAuth page, and why is it critical that it's the legitimate app, right? Because now your SASE and SSE solutions have no indication that this is a malicious site. So the user then goes ahead and logs in, and the apps will ask for a couple of permissions. So you'll see here it's asking for the permission to see, edit, create, and delete all your Google Drive files. And honestly, for the real Draw.io app, that's also the permissions that they ask for. So it's not really suspicious at this point. So the user will go ahead and provide those permissions. And at this point, 2 things might happen. The attacker might have created a fake Draw.io app and they might continue using it, or they might redirect them to the real page. So once this happens, let's take a look at, yeah?
Have you ever a 2-step authentication, like, physical key, for example, access?
I'll show you an example on how to bypass that after this. Yes, that's a good question. So his question is, what if we have an MFA, right? So that's something that we can address with a separate attack. I'll show you right after this. So now we're going back to the user's Google Drive. We're going to see now that the attacker has access to edit the files, what's going to happen. So they'll go ahead and, now that they have access to delete the file, they'll go ahead and delete the files. And now we're showing it in a step-by-step process, but in reality, this will probably all be deleted at once. And of course, once they do this, they'll go ahead and empty out the trash bin as well and the shared device as well. So once everything is cleaned out and removed, what they're going to do is they're going to upload a ransom note that says, hey, you've been attacked. To recover all your files, please go ahead and make us some payments through crypto over here. So now let's let's switch over to the attacker view and see what's being done there. So that fake draw.io app that you see earlier, this is actually what the attacker sees. Now they have full access to all the files on Google Drive, and the first thing they're going to do is to remove all collaborators. This is because they might have some colleagues that are also on the same files. You want to make sure that no one in the organization has access to those files. Once you do that, you can go ahead, they'll probably go ahead and download all the files as zip, and this is so they can do two things. One, the first one is they can restore the files in the event that the ransom is paid, and secondly is to leak the files if the ransom was not made. And once they do that, as we have seen on the user side, they will go ahead and delete the selected files. And given that they have access to also upload files, this is where the ransom note is being uploaded. So as you can see, the kind of social engineering aspect of the attack is actually really small, but the impact that can be created is pretty large by comparison. So the second example that I wanted to show you is compromising the business enterprise email. And why do we choose email to compromise? The reason is because it's actually a great place to do reconnaissance and understand what sort of apps users are using. So let's say you're attacking an enterprise users, but you have no idea what SaaS apps they're using. Most of us use our email to register to pretty much every enterprise SaaS apps. So here in this example, we're going to use consent phishing. Have you guys heard of the Cyberhaven attack back in December?
Say it again.
The Cyberhaven attack? So this is a very similar attack that you'll be seeing. And here, after they get access to the AI, they have access to the email, what we're going to do is we're going to use an AI agent to automatically filter out which are emails related to relevant SaaS apps, systematically reset the password to log the user out and access all the enterprise SaaS apps through this browser ransomware attack. So we'll take a look at how this looks like. So first, the user has received some form of email impersonating, let's say, your IT team that says, hey, we have a new inbox management tool. To register, please go ahead and click this link and sign up using your enterprise account. So the user goes ahead and clicks, believing that it's an email from the IT team. And the page also looks relatively legitimate. And here's the catch. They probably also have a real app that will go ahead and allow them to manage their inbox anyway. So the user goes ahead and logs in with their Google sign up. And very similar to the attack that we saw earlier, this new app will then go ahead and request for some permissions. So here the permissions being requested are read, compose, and send, and permanently delete all your emails. And to be honest, like for an inbox management tool, that's very fair, right? So once they give their permission to do that, as I mentioned, the attacker will actually have some sort of functional app that they're using. So at this point, the user is still not suspicious at all that something wrong is going on. So now let's switch to the attacker view. So you'll see that the attacker now has full access to the user email, every single email that they're receiving. And then they can go ahead and take a look at what sort of enterprise apps they're being signed up to. So they can either, of course, go look for specific apps, or as I mentioned earlier, they can use an AI agent to look for things like sign-up emails or password reset emails in the past. So now the attacker knows two things. One, they know that the user has a Dropbox enterprise account, and second, that they're using the email that they have access to. What they don't know is the password. But the best part here is most password reset just really involves your email, right? So the moment you can go ahead and say, I forgot my password, enter the enterprise email, you'll get a magic link to reset your password via your enterprise email. So as you can see from the attacker side, they can quickly copy out that link and systematically go ahead and reset the password. And once they do that, two things will happen. The first thing is now they have access to the enterprise app. But secondly, they also go ahead and log out the actual user from it.
Yeah, but the email, sorry, I don't know if your word. So the email goes to the actual person, right?
Yeah.
The attacker don't have that email, right? So how they give...
Yeah, so remember earlier when we were looking for the OAuth permissions, there's a permission to read, delete all emails.
Yes.
So that allows them to basically access every single email that they're accessing. But you bring up a good point, because one question would be, well, as the victim, I'm going to see that there's a password reset email that I didn't instigate, right? So I'll show you exactly how this looks like. So from the user point of view, the moment they receive an email, the attacker can go ahead and immediately delete it. So There you go. So you'll see that the email would suddenly just disappear. And of course here it looks pretty slow, just so that everybody can see what's going on. But in reality, everything can be automated, so the moment it hits your inbox, it's gone. So as I mentioned earlier, this allows the attacker to go ahead and access all the documents, in this case in Dropbox. They can download all the files, go ahead and delete it and upload the ransom note, very similar to the Google Drive attack we see earlier. But really this can be applied to any enterprise SaaS app. So let's say if you use Gong to record your customer calls, they might be able to download all the sensitive conversations you have with your customers. Very similarly, I think there's an example later on towards GitHub, right? So most developers now would store part of all of their code on GitHub. So getting access to the GitHub repo would basically allow the attackers not to have full access of the developer's code itself, but pretty much the entire organization's code base. And very similar here to your point earlier, the emails quickly get deleted. The user doesn't even realize that access has been gained. So here we'll show you that once they have access to the GitHub repo, they can go systematically, exfiltrate all the code, remove it. And you can just imagine how disruptive this would be, right, to any company that have any form of coding or tech. And post this, what they can do is, of course, they can also, like earlier, just include a ransom note directly in GitHub, but they can also go ahead, because they have access to the email, just leave a ransom note in the draft or something like that. All right, so the third one, you mentioned about MFA earlier, right? So that's a very good question. And the third example is actually an attack that's using browser extensions. So business email compromise, people are probably familiar with. Drive, it's compromised often. But now we're starting to look at newer attack vectors. What if browser native ransomware can be orchestrated to modern attack vectors like malicious browser extensions? And this is possible because extensions has the ability to inject scripts into your browser and act on the user's behalf. So in January this year, we actually released an attack called browser sync jacking. So this is an attack that allows a malicious browser extension to help an attacker take over the user's browser, turn it into a managed browser that's already pre-authenticated. So the MFA is actually already done even before that. So after that, through the Google Workspace sync function, what they're going to do is they're going to make the users sync their profiles, upload all their local passwords, which allow them to access any of the stored passwords there. So let's take a look at how this looks like. So the first step here is the attacker is going to create a Google Workspace account and a couple of profiles associated with it. And today there is no sort of regulation or identity verification required before creating these accounts. So pretty much, any person could just go on Google Workspace right now and create this. Now once that's done, the second thing that the user does, and you'll see that currently the user is not signed into any managed browser, it's just kind of a free-form account right now. And they probably store a bunch of passwords locally, so I don't know how many of you actually save your password. I certainly hope not. But you can imagine that people who are not at this conference probably would do this. So the second thing that the attacker has prepared is some sort of browser extension. It could mimic itself as some sort of AI tool. It doesn't matter as long as the user goes ahead and installs this extension. And critically, this extension actually doesn't have any sort of severe permissions. It's all very basic, medium to low risk permissions as classified by Chrome. And what this is going to do is it'll continue to provide its functionality as promised, but as the user is browsing, at some point once they detect that it's idle, if you quickly untrack this, so here this is the unmanaged profile, right? You'll see at some point it starts to shift to a managed profile. And what happened there is basically the extension had injected a script that registered the user into the managed profile that we created earlier. So if you just keep looking at that, there you go, it suddenly become another profile. And the other thing that they're going to do while the browser is idle is to redirect the user to the official Google kind of sync page. But they can now inject a content that basically changes the data there and shows that, hey, in order to proceed, please go ahead and sync your profile. It doesn't have to be Google. It could be your victim's IT department. It can be any website that instigates the user to do this action. Now, if you take a look, all the user needs to do is hit sync. And what happens when you sync your profile is basically all that stored passwords that you see earlier is now uploaded and associated with your Google Workspace account. such that if the attacker logs into the same account on their device, they now have access to all your locally stored passwords, and this will allow them to slowly, systematically log into every single of your enterprise account and exfiltrate the data there. So this is an example where they logged into HubSpot, downloaded all your sales data, meeting notes, project plans, everything. And again, very similar to earlier, replaced it with a ransom note. So I think you guys are starting to get the gist here. Regardless of what identity attack you used in the beginning, there's a lot of things that you can do with browser native ransomware. And given that we're in the cloud village, let's take a look at how this can be exploited, right? So most cloud service providers like AWS, Azure, and GCP have web consoles which you control a lot of the things on. And if attacker can gain control to a browser through attacks like browser sync jacking and basically compromise a privileged user, what happens is now they can have full access and control to the entire organization's cloud data and infrastructure, as well as their services and security as well. So this is really a potent way for them to not just increase the impact of the attack, but also to laterally move across the organization as well. So what is the impact of browser native ransomware? Now you guys are probably familiar about how ransomware itself can be very detrimental. So let's do a quick recap of that and then we'll see why browser native ransomware is even more impactful, right? So the first one is of course the financial losses that comes with it. The obvious part is the ransom payments itself, but there's also a lot of loss of revenue when it comes to operational disruption. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the MGM Resorts hack that happened 2 years ago.
Oh, MGM.
Yeah. So that alone I think cost 100 million in lost revenue in the first quarter alone. I remember I was in the UK when the kind of WannaCry came out, so I think that cost the government around like $10 billion in total. So the financial losses are insane, right? But you could argue that the long-term losses are actually come from the reputational damage that comes with it. So whenever a customer data is leaked or a service is down for an extended period of time, you tend to lose customer trust quite a lot. I think there was a study by Panoma Institute that whenever there's a ransomware attack, 65% of customers would consider switching their vendors. And of course, the legal consequences that come with it is quite large as well. So as data privacy laws like GDPR become stricter, you get a lot of penalty for violating these laws when it comes to fines, class action lawsuits, and there's also long legal battles that you have to deal with. And I think increasingly the reason why ransomware has been such a big topic is also the fact that a lot of board members and security leaders can now be personally liable if an attack happens. So we've seen that in Uber and a couple of other cases as well. And I think one other interesting trend is there's been a lot of laws that have been instituted in the past few years on how ransomware payments are something that is much more restricted today. So for example, during COVID, the US Treasury Department Office of Foreign Assets Control basically now said that payments to sanctioned countries for ransomware attacks are now constituted as a breach of US sanction laws. And similarly, I believe the UK currently is discussing a bill which would make all ransomware payments illegal. But what about browser native ransomware, right? So unfortunately, I have bad news for you. The impact that it can bring is actually much, much worse. So as we mentioned earlier, most of our enterprise data is now being stored in the cloud. So in terms of attack surface, it's already much wider, the impact that they can create. Additionally, existing tools can't really defend against browser native ransomware today. So a lot of our enterprise data is just wide open to these attacks. So unlike managed devices where you can lock down every single app that can be installed, what you can perform there, as a user in the browser, as long as I have a credit card and email, I can go ahead and sign up to any SaaS app. And you can see earlier how detrimental that is with like a new app that has access to your Google Drive emails and so on. And unfortunately, most enterprises have very little visibility to what apps you're using online, and especially not the permissions and the activities that are being conducted on them. And I think the key point here is due to the shared drives and shared resources that are in a lot of these apps, as long as you are able to compromise one user, you can pretty much access all the shared resources in the device. So you no longer have to just compromise now you only need to compromise one single person to be able to gain access to that. And this, unfortunately, is not something that's just a theory. We've already started seeing attackers doing this in many aspects. So certain components, especially on the identity attack side, data exfiltration, has already started being seen. So for example, the Cyberhaven attack that we discussed earlier, Midnight Blizzard did some attack using RDP files. A lot of them are really focusing on the user identity in the browser. And while we haven't seen an exact browser native ransomware occur, being described in that specific way. All it takes is one attacker to figure out how to chain all these things together and create a large-scale attack. Yeah?
Is it browser isolation help? Like some of the, like there is a container, like you can spin up the Firefox, and then based on that, when you turn, like shut it down, everything erase, or like different type of thing. Is there a way to counterize it, like to make it?
That's a good question. So browser isolation is really good at, to its name, isolating your browser from the endpoint. So yes, it can help with things like malware downloads and things like that. But because all of these attacks live and die in the browser, you can see that nothing actually ever touches the endpoint.
Yeah.
So all the whole attack from the identity attack, you can see that phishing can still happen in these scenarios, right? So unfortunately, it's not something that browser isolation can support with.
Thank you.
Of course.
Do you have a question?
So just a quick summary, as more and more workflow move to the cloud, SaaS apps now hold the majority of enterprise data, making them really attractive targets for attackers. And unfortunately today, the solutions that we have that protect against ransomware are very much focused on local files and local processes. And browser native ransomware is a new class of ransomware that lives and dies in the browser and unfortunately are not detectable by these solutions. And in order to be relevant to the future, it's very likely that attackers are already using ransomware that are browser native. And because of the existence of shared drive and resources, we have seen how this impact can be greater than traditional ransomware. Well, that's the end of the talk. Thank you so much for listening.